The Russo-Japanese War was fought between Japan and Russia in the early 20th century. In the previous article, I explained the Battle of the Sea of Japan, where Togo won a complete victory over the Baltic Fleet. In this article, I will explain the last chapter, the Portsmouth Treaty. Gentaro Kodama, Chief of Staff of the Manchurian Army, was strongly praying for victory in the Battle of the Sea of Japan. The result of the Battle of the Sea of Japan would pave the way for ending the war. The Japanese army was so exhausted that it no longer had the strength to fight the war. By the time of the Battle of Mukden, Japan had mobilized 1.8 million soldiers and suffered 200,000 casualties. The casualty rate was particularly high for the enlisted men leading the battlefield, and even if new soldiers were mobilized, there were severe shortages of enlisted men to supervise them. In other words, the Japanese army was no longer as strong as it had been at the beginning. After the Battle of Mukden, Kodama returned to Tokyo under the guise of reporting the war situation to Emperor Meiji. Unaware of the serious situation of the army, the upper echelons of the imperial headquarters continued the invasion, and some thought that Russian territory should be cut off. Unless he could persuade them, the war might be prolonged further. Kodama strongly advised government officials and the upper echelons of the Imperial Japanese Army that this was the time to end the war favorably. Thanks to their efforts, a policy was decided to proceed with peace with Russia pending the outcome of the Battle of the Sea of Japan. On May 27, 1905, the Allied fleet led by Togo completely crushed the Baltic Fleet. With this, Russia completely lost control of the seas around the Sea of Japan. The Japanese government knew that Russia was on the eve of revolution and was not ready for war. The government saw victory in this naval battle as the perfect opportunity for peace. Foreign Minister Jotaro Komuro was thinking of having the U.S. act as an intermediary for peace. Why was it the United States? President Theodore Roosevelt had made his support for Japan clear from the beginning of the war. He was so pro-Japanese that he said, "Japan is fighting for America." The U.S. also wanted to avoid a situation in which Japan or Russia would win a one-sided victory and monopolize East Asian interests. The United States also wanted to expand into China. On June 9, Roosevelt formally proposed peace negotiations to Japan and Russia. The location was Portsmouth, a city with a military port. Roosevelt had also proposed an invasion of Sakhalin in order to gain an advantageous peace with Japan. Taro Katsura, the Prime Minister, asked Hirobumi Ito, the great politician of the Meiji period, to be the ambassador plenipotentiary for the peace. Katsura anticipated that the terms of the peace that Japan would have to accept would be unacceptable to the people. It was hoped that Hirobumi Ito, the spiritual pillar of the Meiji era who had served 4 times as Prime Minister, would be able to allay the people's discontent. Ito had initially planned to accept the job, but his close associates were very opposed to the idea. The reason was that the Prime Minister Katsura shouldered the honor of victory in the war, and Ito should not be solely responsible for the people's dissatisfaction and resentment resulting from the peace. In the end, Ito declined the position of ambassador plenipotentiary. Instead, the ambassador plenipotentiary was appointed by Foreign Minister Jotaro Komuro. He was the man who had concluded the Anglo-Japanese alliance. Hirobumi Ito also anticipated that the terms of the peace would be very difficult for Japan to accept. Ito said to Komuro, "Your work will be a great disappointment to the people. But when you return, I will be there to greet you." The great politician Inoue also tearfully told Komuro, "I am very sorry that I have forced you to do this job. Your great achievements may be ruined by this peace. Let us now turn our attention to Russia." The Tsar was greatly dismayed by the Baltic fleet's crushing defeat at the Battle of the Sea of Japan. After this defeat, there were insurrections and riots in various parts of Russia that were anti-war. The First Russian Revolution had already begun. The Tsar knew that he could no longer continue the war. The Tsar appointed Sergei Witte as ambassador plenipotentiary. He was opposed to this war for financial reasons and was removed from the center of power. The Tsar had instructed him, do not give a handful of land or a single ruble to Japan. His mission was also a tough one. Witt, who was ready for peace, behaved as if he were the victor after arriving in Portsmouth. He showed that Russia did not want peace and could still fight. In fact, Russia used the Liberian Railway to mobilize soldiers to the Far East in droves. On June 30th, Prime Minister Katsura presented Komura with Japan's terms for peace. What is absolutely non-negotiable is 1. Recognition of Korea as under Japanese supervision. 2. Complete withdrawal of Japanese and Russian troops from Manchuria. 3. Transfer of the Liaodong Peninsula lease and the Harbin-Rushun Railroad. The issues that they wanted to see advanced in the negotiations is 1. Compensation for military expenses. 2. Cession of Sakhalin and the islands. 3. Acquisition of fishing rights along the coast. The Japanese people believed that the Japanese army was completely victorious and that Russia was defeated and wished to make peace, due to the Japanese military's control of information. The Imperial Japanese Army was also hiding from the public that Japan did not have the strength to continue the war. Therefore, even before this peace began, there were high hopes for how much compensation Japan would receive. Newspapers were agitating for a minimum of 3 billion yen in reparations and the cession of Sakhalin. Komura left for the peace talks with the expectations of the Japanese people in mind. Negotiations were predictably difficult. Russia acknowledged Japan's right to supervise Korea, the withdrawal of its troops from Manchuria, and Russia's right to lease the Liaodong Peninsula. However, he refused to take possession of Sakhalin, pay military expenses, or hand over Russian warships that had fled to neutral countries. By order of the Russian Tsar, Witt was categorically denied reparations and land cessions. It was here that a certain Japanese maneuver paid off. It was the invasion of Sakhalin, which Roosevelt had also proposed. This invasion of Sakhalin also triggered the Tsar to hasten peace negotiations. He wanted to start peace negotiations before Sakhalin fell into Japanese hands. This was because Sakhalin had no transportation system capable of moving a large army and had only a small garrison. Thus, the Japanese were able to occupy the southern half of Sakhalin before peace could begin. Witt used this Sakhalin as a subject for negotiations. Witt suggested to Komura that in exchange for our ceding Sakhalin, you guys could give up your reparations. Komura replied that we had already occupied the Sakhalin and that the people wanted reparations. Roosevelt is said to have suggested that Komura waive reparations. Komura, however, was well aware of the public's expectations and could not consider waiving reparations. Komura told the Japanese government that if reparations could not be obtained, he would abandon the peace process. This surprised the Japanese government. An extraordinary cabinet meeting was held to discuss the issue. Knowing that the war could not continue, the government ordered Komura to continue the peace process even if it meant giving up reparations and territory. The government also heard from the British that the Tsar Nikolai was of the opinion that the southern half of Sakhalin could be conceded. Witt also thought that the cession of the occupied southern Sakhalin was inevitable and that peace was possible if Japan would waive reparations. Thus, with Komura's waiver of reparations and Witt's approval of the cession of South Sakhalin, the peace process began to move forward at once. Thus, peace was concluded on September 5 with the following conditions: recognition of Korea under Japanese supervision, withdrawal of Russian troops from Manchuria, cession of South Sakhalin, and waiver of reparations. The Japanese government's intention, "We did not go to war because we wanted money," was favorably received by countries other than Japan. However, the Japanese people exploded with frustration that Japan, which had won a series of wars, could not get reparations from Russia. The Japanese military could have foreseen that informing the public about the actual situation of the Japanese military would jeopardize peace. Military secrets should not be known to the public. On September 5, the day the peace was announced, a rally was held in Hibiya Park in Tokyo to denounce Komura's diplomacy. In an attempt to prevent this, clashes broke out between police forces and the people. Tens of thousands of people attacked the Prime Minister's official residence, residences of government officials, police boxes, and trains, prompting the government to mobilize the military and impose martial law. The people could not allow this peace to be the result of shedding so much blood, losing relatives, and enduring heavy taxes. In October, Komura returned from the United States. As promised, Hirobumi Ito welcomed Komura. Komura was heckled. He was told to commit seppuku immediately and go back to Russia, not Japan. Prime Minister Katsura and Minister of the Navy Yamamoto walked alongside Komura on either side of him. It is said that the Prime Minister and the Minister walked to protect Komura from assassins who might shoot him. Victory in this war was an opportunity for the world to recognize Japan as a first-class nation. After this victory, Japan succeeded in abolishing all unequal treaties with Western nations, which had been a long-held dream of Japan since the Meiji Restoration. Japan was the only non-white nation to join the ranks of the great powers and become one of the five powers. This victory in the Russo-Japanese War changed the nature of Japan as a nation. In 1910, Japan annexed Korea. Next, it no longer hid its ambitions to expand into China. Yes, Japan had clearly changed from being a nation bullied by other nations to a nation that bullies other nations.